December 1943, Tunis. A German intelligence officer hunched over decoded American traffic, pen scratching notes as he listened to the crackling wire intercepts filtering through North Africa. He underlined a name, Eisenhower, and smirked, turning to his colleague. They've put a desk general in charge of Europe, a man who's never commanded a battalion in combat. The Americans are sending a politician to fight a war. He tapped the paper with contempt. Patton would have been dangerous. This one, he'll drown in committees before he ever sees Berlin. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week we uncover the stories the world forgot. What that officer didn't know was that George Marshall, the architect of American victory, had made the most calculated gamble of the war. Not on audacity, but on restraint. Not on genius, but on patience. And that choice, made in the sterile quiet of a Washington office, while men bled in the snow at Kasserine, would shape every mile from Normandy to the Elbe. It would cost months. It would cost lives. And it would win the war. The choice itself was a study in contrasts. Two men forged in the same crucible, but tempered into entirely different weapons. George S. Patton, third-generation warrior, Olympic pentathlete, a man who believed in reincarnation because he was certain he'd fought at Cannae and Agincourt. His tactical mind operated in 3 dimensions at speeds that left staff officers scrambling. He could read terrain like sheet music, sensing where an enemy flank would crack 6 hours before it happened. His Third Army would eventually move faster and farther than any army in human history, across France in a mechanized blitzkrieg that made the Germans' 1940 dash look cautious. 500 miles in 4 weeks, 11,000 square miles liberated. But Patton was volatile. A man whose brilliance came wrapped in ego and rage, whose mouth moved faster than his judgment, whose belief in his own destiny bordered on messianic. He slapped shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals, called them cowards while they trembled from combat fatigue that would break lesser men. He gave interviews comparing himself to conquerors, while his superiors tried to keep Allied coalitions from splintering. Patton was a sword, sharp, deadly, impossible to sheath safely. Dwight Eisenhower was the sheath. A Kansas farm boy who'd graduated from West Point middle of his pack. Never heard a shot fired in anger during the First World War, while Patton earned his tanker spurs at St. Mihiel. Eisenhower spent 2 decades in staff assignments, studying logistics and production schedules, learning how to make colonels and generals and politicians agree on things they hated. He had a smile that disarmed skeptics, and a temper he'd learned to bury so deep that even his closest aides rarely saw it crack. Where Patton saw war as Homeric drama, Eisenhower saw it as an engineering problem with human variables. He understood that beating Germany wasn't about dash and glory. It was about landing 1 million men on a hostile shore, keeping them fed with 10,000 tons of supplies daily, coordinating navies and air forces, and competing egos from 4 different nations, holding together an alliance that included Winston Churchill's imperial nostalgia and Charles de Gaulle's prickly nationalism and Bernard Montgomery's insufferable certainty. Eisenhower knew that brilliance without diplomacy was just another way to lose. Marshall saw all of it. He'd watched Patton burn hot and bright through North Africa, seen him crack the Axis line at El Guetter, watched him race Montgomery to Messina in Sicily like it was a personal vendetta. He'd also watched Patton humiliate himself and the army, jeopardize Allied unity, hand Goebbels propaganda on a silver platter. And he'd watched Eisenhower hold the coalition together through Torch, through Kasserine's bitter lessons, through the delicate dance of making Montgomery think he was in charge while actually keeping him on a leash. Marshall was building something unprecedented, a truly combined arms force, American industry married to British experience, democracy trying to outfight fascism's head start. That machine needed a conductor, not a soloist. The decision came in a quiet conversation, Roosevelt and Marshall alone, December sunlight slanting through the Oval Office windows. The president had assumed he'd lead Overlord himself, the liberation of Europe, the Great Crusade, with his name attached for history. Marshall never asked for it. He simply waited, presenting options with the clarity that had made him indispensable, letting Roosevelt see the problem whole. If Marshall went to Europe, who would manage the global war from Washington? Who understood the Pacific and Atlantic theaters equally? Who could stand up to MacArthur's ego and King's Navy parochialism and keep the chiefs of staff from tearing strategy apart. The president saw it, sighed, made the call. "I couldn't sleep at night with you out of the country," Roosevelt said. Marshall nodded, and Eisenhower got the job. Patton, when he learned, raged privately, then swallowed it with the discipline of a man who knew insubordination meant the end. He would serve under Eisenhower, his junior in date of rank, a man he'd mentored in tank doctrine 20 years prior. But Eisenhower would need him, need that predatory instinct, that killer edge. And so Patton would wait, ready, sharpening his sword in England while the greatest invasion in history took shape. The cost revealed itself slowly, a ledger written in blood and time. Eisenhower's caution was strategic. He would not move until every detail aligned, every supply line secure, every contingency planned. Operation Overlord became a masterpiece of preparation. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men hitting 5 beaches simultaneously, backed by an artificial harbor and an underwater fuel pipeline, and a deception scheme that convinced Hitler the real invasion would come at Calais. It was brilliant. It was thorough. And it took time. Where Patton might have risked an earlier D-Day, gambling on speed over certainty, Eisenhower waited for perfect conditions, tides, moon, weather windows that aligned once a month. The invasion slipped from May to June. That month mattered. German divisions in France gained strength, fortified beaches further, moved reserves into position. The Atlantic Wall grew teeth. And when June 6th finally came, when those landing craft doors dropped and men poured into the steel storm at Omaha Beach, they paid for perfection in bodies. 2,400 American casualties at Omaha alone in the first hours, men drowning in surf weighted down by packs, cut apart by MG-42s, firing from bunkers Rommel had reinforced through that extra month. The plan worked. The Allies got ashore, held the beachhead, began the breakout, but it cost more than it might have. Eisenhower's caution was prudent. It was also expensive. The campaign that followed showed the pattern repeating. Eisenhower commanded by consensus, balancing egos, letting Montgomery lead the ground war initially because British pride demanded recognition, even as Monty's methodical advance turned into a grinding stalemate. 7 weeks to take a city they hoped to capture on D-Day. 7 weeks of hedgerow hell, American infantry learning that French farmland was a defender's paradise. Every field bordered by earth berms and thick hedges that turned tanks into sitting targets. Every advance costing 50 yards and a dozen lives. Patton, still sidelined, commanding a phantom army in the deception scheme, watched from England and fumed. When Patton finally unleashed, late July, Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, he showed what Marshall's choice had traded. Third Army roared through the gap torn open by Bradley's First Army. Patton's columns moving so fast German commanders lost track of where they were. He ignored flanks, ignored supply doctrine, pushed his tanks until they ran on fumes, and his trucks stole gasoline from depots they were supposed to guard. 11,000 square miles in 4 weeks. 500 miles across France. He pivoted 90 degrees at full speed to relieve Bastogne in December. A maneuver military theorists said was impossible, turning 3 divisions in a snowstorm and attacking within 48 hours. Patton was chaos incarnate, and chaos won battles. But Eisenhower had to manage the chaos. Every time Patton surged, he outran his fuel, left gaps Montgomery screamed about, threatened to fracture the line. Eisenhower reined him in, diverted supplies north to Monty's ponderous advance, kept a broad front strategy that enraged Patton but prevented catastrophic breakthroughs. "My men can eat their belts," Patton snarled, "but my tanks have got to have gas." Eisenhower spread the fuel thin, kept everyone moving, kept the alliance intact. It was sound strategy. It was agonizingly slow. The cost crystallized in September 1944. The Allies stood at the German border, Wehrmacht reeling, Hitler's regime teetering. Patton wanted to punch straight through, across the Rhine, into the Ruhr, cut Germany in half before winter. He had 300 miles of momentum and an enemy on the edge of collapse. Eisenhower said no. Supplies couldn't support a single thrust. Montgomery needed resources for his own drive north. The broad front would grind forward together, methodical, safe. Patton's tanks sat idle, crews watching fuel trucks drive past to supply Monty's market garden, the airborne operation that dropped 30,000 paratroopers into Holland in a bid to seize bridges and end the war by Christmas. Market Garden failed, Montgomery's caution masquerading as boldness, dropping elite troops into a city where 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting, trusting a single highway to link airborne and armor, ignoring intelligence that screamed disaster. The British 1st Airborne Division got annihilated at Arnhem. 10,000 men killed or captured. The bridge too far. And while that unfolded, Patton sat in Lorraine, rationing ammunition, watching the Germans dig in along the Siegfried Line. The moment passed. The quick war died. Winter came. Eisenhower's choice, caution over audacity, consensus over command, bought time for Germany to stabilize. The Wehrmacht pulled back to defensive positions, rebuilt shattered divisions, fortified the Rhine. What might have collapsed in September held through December. And in the Ardennes, in the frozen forests of Belgium, Hitler found the strength for one last desperate offensive. The Bulge cost 19,000 American dead, 70,000 casualties total, delayed the advance into Germany by weeks. Patton's Third Army had to pivot again, save the line again, prove again that audacity wins when caution falters. The counterfactual haunts military historians. If Patton had commanded Overlord, would he have invaded earlier, accepted higher risk for faster victory? Almost certainly. Would he have broken through Normandy faster, ignored Montgomery's stalled advance, pushed for the Rhine in September when the door stood open? Without question. Would he have ended the war in 1944, saved the lives lost in the Bulge and the Rhineland and the final bitter months? Maybe. Or maybe he'd have outrun his supplies catastrophically, left his flanks exposed, handed Rommel or modeled the chance for a killing counterstroke that shattered the invasion entire. Maybe his ego would have fractured the alliance, sent Churchill and de Gaulle into fits, lost the political war while winning tactical battles. Maybe brilliance without Eisenhower's patience would have been just another way to lose. Marshall understood the gamble. He chose the man who could hold the coalition together, who wouldn't gift the enemy propaganda, who'd planned so thoroughly that even with delays, even with higher costs, victory was inevitable. He chose the manager over the warrior, the diplomat over the killer, and that choice defined how America won, not through a single brilliant thrust, but through overwhelming industrial strength applied methodically, coalition warfare that ground the enemy down through sheer mass and coordination. The weapons America fielded reflected that philosophy. The M4 Sherman tank, maligned for being undergunned against Panthers and Tigers, mocked by crews who called it a Ronson because it lit up like the lighter, was designed for exactly Eisenhower's kind of war. Not invincible, but producible. 49,000 Shermans built versus 1,800 Tigers. A Sherman couldn't kill a Tiger from the front at range, but 5 Shermans could swarm it, flank it, overwhelm it through numbers and speed. The Sherman had a Ford GAA V8 engine pumping 450 horsepower, giving it 26 miles per hour on roads, reliability German tanks couldn't match. It had a gyrostabilizer for the 75mm gun, crude but functional, letting it fire accurately while moving, something no German tank could do. And it had a crew escape hatch that meant when it did brew up, men could bail out in seconds. American tank doctrine wasn't about dueling. It was about arriving in overwhelming force, supported by artillery and air, grinding forward until nothing stood. The Sherman's weakness was Eisenhower's war in miniature, accepting tactical limitations in exchange for strategic inevitability. Patton understood this better than anyone, even as he chafed against it. "I'd rather have a good tank in June than a perfect tank in December," he told his staff after losing Shermans to Panthers at Aricourt. His Third Army compensated with speed and combined arms, using M10 tank destroyers with 3-inch guns to hunt armor, calling in P-47 Thunderbolts with 5-inch rockets to crack open German positions, keeping the Shermans moving fast enough that German heavies couldn't establish killing zones. At Aricourt, in September 1944, Patton's 4th Armored Division destroyed 281 German tanks and assault guns while losing just 25 Shermans. Not through better armor, but through better tactics, better air support, better logistics that kept fuel and ammunition flowing while the Germans ran dry. That logistical machine was Eisenhower's true genius. the invisible foundation that made every offensive possible. By autumn 1944, American forces in Europe consumed 800,000 tons of supplies monthly: food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, all flowing from ports in Normandy and Brittany through a transportation network rebuilt faster than the Germans could believe. The Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks driven around the clock by predominantly black quartermaster units, hauled 12,000 tons daily across France. Drivers going without sleep for 70-hour shifts, keeping Patton's tanks moving even when the railroads hadn't been repaired. Each Sherman needed 150 gallons of fuel per 100 miles. Each infantry division required 650 tons of supplies daily. The numbers were staggering, the coordination absurd, and it worked because Eisenhower had spent 20 years learning how to make impossible logistics look routine. Marshall had bet on that capability. American industry married to methodical planning, and the production statistics justified him. In 1944 alone, American factories built 96,000 aircraft, including 17,000 B, 17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators that turned German cities into rubble and German industry into memory. They built 17,000 Sherman tanks, 50,000 jeeps, 2 million rifles, 40 billion rounds of ammunition. They launched a Liberty ship every 42 hours, each one carrying 10,000 tons of cargo to Europe or the Pacific. The arsenal of democracy wasn't a metaphor. It was a tidal wave of steel and explosives that rose higher every month, drowning Axis production capacity under sheer volume. Germany, by contrast, was strangling. Even with slave labor and total mobilization, German industry produced 27,000 aircraft in 1944, 9,000 tanks, and assault guns. Quality was high. The Panther tank was mechanically superior to the Sherman in almost every measure. The Bf-109G and Fw-190 fighter planes deadly in skilled hands, but there weren't enough of them, and the skilled hands were dying faster than training could replace them. A Luftwaffe pilot in 1944 received 60 hours of training before combat assignment. His American opponent received 300 hours, knew his aircraft inside out, could push it to limits the enemy couldn't risk. When they met over France or the Rhine, experience mattered more than the airframe. The P-51 Mustang embodied that edge. Designed around a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing 1,490 horsepower, it could hit 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, climb to altitude in minutes, and with drop tanks carry enough fuel to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, 1,100 miles. German fighters had terrorized bomber formations for 2 years, slashing through without escorts, forcing daylight raids into suicidal gambles. The Mustang ended that. It arrived in numbers, 8,000 built by war's end, flown by pilots who trained in the vast skies over Texas and Arizona, learning energy tactics and gunnery until instinct took over. 6.50 caliber machine guns, 1,700 rounds per minute combined fire rate, converging at 300 yards into a cone of destruction that tore wings off and shattered cockpits. Luftwaffe veterans learned to fear the Mustang's profile, the belly scoop, the laminar flow wing, the way it dove and climbed without losing energy. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, one German pilot wrote post-war, I knew the war was lost. Not because they were better machines. We still had advantages in certain regimes, but because there were so many, and they were flown by men who'd had time to learn properly. They didn't make mistakes. They worked in pairs, covering each other, patient. They could afford to be patient. We had to kill quickly or die. That patience, that willingness to wait for perfect readiness, was pure Eisenhower doctrine. The bomber offensive against Germany, Operation Point Blank, was a grinding campaign of attrition, designed not just to destroy factories, but to force the Luftwaffe into battles it couldn't win. Every raid pulled up German fighters. Every fighter shot down was a pilot lost, and Germany couldn't replace pilots as fast as America could replace bombers. The 8th Air Force lost 43,000 aircrew killed, the highest casualty rate of any American service. But they flew 3,300 heavy bombers on some days, waves so dense they blackened the sky. And when German interceptors rose to meet them, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts were waiting. By D-Day, The Luftwaffe was a ghost over France, unable to contest the invasion, reduced to scattered attacks that barely scratched the Armada. Patton exploited that air superiority ruthlessly. His Third Army operations fused ground and air into a single weapon, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings flying cab-rank sorties, loitering over the battlefield waiting for radio calls from tank columns, then screaming down with bombs and rockets and .50 cal fire to crack open strongpoints minutes before armor arrived. "I can never get enough air support," Patton told his staff, "but what I get wins battles faster than artillery." At Falaise Gap in August 1944, Allied aircraft turned the German retreat into a slaughter. Thousands of vehicles destroyed, horses and men littering the roads, Patton's tanks closing the pocket, while Typhoons and Thunderbolts strafed anything that moved. Eisenhower visited the site afterward and nearly vomited at the carnage. Patton saw it and smiled. "The more we kill here," he said, "the fewer we fight later." That pragmatism, brutal, efficient, unapologetic, was what Marshall needed in the field. But he needed Eisenhower above it, managing the coalition, keeping Churchill focused, preventing Montgomery from turning every conference into a lecture on British military superiority. The broad front strategy that enraged Patton was politically necessary. If Eisenhower had given Patton everything and let Monty's forces stagnate, the British government might have pulled support, fractured Allied unity at the moment victory was closest. If he'd let Patton race to Berlin alone, Stalin would have screamed about Anglo-American betrayal, potentially jeopardizing post-war cooperation. Eisenhower played a larger game than battlefield tactics. He was winning the peace while Patton won the battles. The cost of that balancing act became most visible in the final months. Germany collapsed in stages through early 1945, armies disintegrating under pressure from east and west, but the collapse took time. The Ruhr Pocket, 325,000 German soldiers encircled in April, could have been bypassed, left to wither, letting Allied armies race for Berlin. Instead, Eisenhower stopped to reduce it methodically, following doctrine, eliminating threats systematically. Meanwhile, Soviet armies smashed into Berlin from the east, paying in blood for the symbolic victory. 100,000 Soviet soldiers died taking the capital. Eisenhower let them have it, argued it wasn't worth American lives for a city already divided on occupation maps. Patton disagreed violently, wanted to beat the Soviets to Berlin, to Prague, to establish facts on the ground that politics could build on. "Ike," he said in one heated exchange, "I can be in Berlin in 48 hours. Eisenhower shook his head. "The Russians have paid for that right," he replied. Marshall backed Eisenhower. The broad front held. The alliance survived. Post-war assessments still argue the counterfactual. If Patton had commanded, racing for Berlin, seizing Prague, establishing Western military presence deep in Eastern Europe before Soviet consolidation, would the Cold War have unfolded differently? Would Stalin have been more cautious, less aggressive? If faced with American armor already occupying capitals, he considered his sphere? Or would it have sparked confrontation sooner, turned allies into enemies before Germany was fully defeated, risked the entire coalition for uncertain gain? Eisenhower chose caution. Marshall approved. History will never know the alternative. What history does know is the final scoreboard. American forces in Europe numbered 4 million by V-Day, organized into 90 divisions, supported by the largest logistical apparatus ever assembled. They'd advanced from Normandy to the Elbe, liberated France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, half of Germany. They destroyed 360 Wehrmacht divisions, killed or captured millions of German soldiers, ended Hitler's regime. They'd done it with a casualty rate lower than any other Allied power. 586,000 casualties total, including 135,000 killed, versus Soviet losses exceeding 11 million. American industrial production had outstripped the entire Axis combined. 2/3 of all Allied military equipment came from American factories. The Sherman tank, maligned and mocked, had crushed panzer divisions through sheer numbers. The Mustang fighter had swept the Luftwaffe from the sky. The Liberty ship had kept the supplies flowing. And Eisenhower's methodical, patient, coalition-focused command had held it all together. Patton's Third Army alone had advanced farther and faster than any army in history. Over 600,000 square miles liberated, 10,000 towns and cities freed, 800,000 enemy soldiers captured or killed, fewer than 137,000 Third Army casualties total. His operational art, aggressive reconnaissance, rapid exploitation, combined arms integration, rewrote doctrine. But he'd done it within Eisenhower's framework. His brilliance channeled by the structure Marshall had built. His audacity leashed just enough to prevent disaster while still achieving miracles. The German perspective, excavated from post-war interrogations and memoirs, acknowledged the paradox. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, signing the surrender at Reims, remarked to an aide that the Americans had won through organization, not genius. Their commanders were competent, rarely brilliant, he said, but their system was unstoppable. Every unit we destroyed, they replaced within days. Every tank we killed, 5 more appeared. They made war industrial, impersonal. You couldn't defeat them because defeating one division, one corps, meant nothing. The machines simply produced more. In a Nuremberg cell before execution, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel wrote in his diary about the contrast he'd observed. Patton was dangerous. He understood tempo, pursued relentlessly. If he had commanded the invasion, we might have lost faster, or we might have found the opening to split their forces. But Eisenhower gave us no openings. He was boring, methodical, and inevitable. You cannot defeat inevitable. That inevitability was Marshall's design. He'd chosen the commander who would guarantee victory, not gamble for faster victory. The cost was measured in months and lives. The soldiers who died in the Hürtgen forest, grinding through German defenses that a faster offensive might have bypassed. The paratroopers lost at Arnhem and Montgomery's failed gamble. The infantry who froze in the Bulge because the war hadn't ended in 1944. Every delay was paid in blood, and Eisenhower's caution demanded delays. But the alternative risks were unknowable. Patton unleashed completely might have won faster. He also might have outrun support so catastrophically that a German counteroffensive could have shattered the Allied line, prolonged the war, cost more lives ultimately than Eisenhower's caution. He might have fractured the coalition, sent the British into separate operations, let the Germans defeat divided forces. Marshall's genius was recognizing that winning with certainty, even slowly, was strategically superior to gambling on speed. The weapons and systems America fielded reflected that philosophy at every level. The Norden bomb sight, a mechanical computer that calculated bomb release points accounting for altitude, airspeed, wind drift, was designed for precision, for methodical destruction of specific industrial targets. It didn't work as advertised. Circular error at 25,000 feet was often half a mile, but it represented the American approach. Engineer the problem, build the tool, apply it systematically. The proximity fuse, a miniature radar in an artillery shell that detonated automatically near targets, devastating against aircraft and infantry, was a technological marvel. 30,000 components in a 5-inch package, designed to give American artillery unbeatable effectiveness. It worked. Anti-aircraft effectiveness quadrupled. German infantry learned to fear American artillery barrages that burst at tree height, shredding anything below with shrapnel. The infrastructure programs Eisenhower championed, building airfields across France in weeks, laying fuel pipelines underwater, constructing mulberry artificial harbors on Normandy beaches, were engineering marvels that made subsequent operations possible. Patton needed that infrastructure to race across France. Every gallon of fuel his tanks burned came through ports Eisenhower's logistics teams had opened, across roads his engineers had repaired, from refineries in America that Marshall's production boards had expanded. The visible battle was Patton's armor smashing through German lines. The invisible battle was Eisenhower's vast machine keeping that armor fed, fueled, armed. Today, in museums across America and Europe, Sherman tanks sit silent on display floors, turrets frozen, tracks still. Children climb on them, touching steel that crossed Europe under fire. The placards list specifications: 30 tons, 400 horsepower, 75mm gun, and mention they were inferior to German armor, but produced in overwhelming numbers. The placards don't capture the sound of a Sherman column moving at speed. Tracks clanking, engines roaring, the earth trembling as 50 machines rolled past. They don't capture the smell of cordite and oil, The way crews painted nicknames on the hulls. Fury. In the Mood. Murder Incorporated. Making cold steel personal. They don't capture the young men inside. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit. Trained for months at Fort Knox and Camp Polk, until they could load and fire in seconds, until they knew every gauge and lever by touch in darkness. In a quiet corner of the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, a display holds a worn leather jacket. 3 stars on each shoulder belong to the general himself. Next to it, a quote from his diary, written in December 1944 after the relief of Bastogne. Ike doesn't understand that war is won by audacity, not logistics. But I suppose someone has to count the beans while the rest of us fight. The museum doesn't include Eisenhower's reply to a similar complaint, found in his papers. George wins battles brilliantly. I win wars. Both men were right. Patton's Third Army achieved operational miracles because Eisenhower's system made those miracles sustainable. Eisenhower's methodical advance succeeded because Patton's cutting edge kept the enemy off balance, unable to consolidate, terrified of the inevitable breakthrough. Marshall understood they needed both, the killer and the manager, the sword and the sheath. His choice wasn't Eisenhower over Patton. It was Eisenhower above Patton, placing the patient diplomat in overall command and letting the warrior do what warriors do best within a framework that guaranteed victory. The final accounting lies in numbers that still stagger. 11 million American service members mobilized, 89,000 aircraft built for combat, 300,000 military vehicles produced, 2 million tons of ammunition shipped monthly at the war's peak, 43,000 tanks and armored vehicles, the industrial output of one nation exceeding the entire Axis combined, applied through a command structure that channeled fury into strategy, audacity into achievable objectives, overwhelming force into inevitable victory. In a German bunker archive, recently digitized, a staff officer's memo from December 1943 survives. The same officer who'd mocked Eisenhower's appointment, writing 3 months later. We have underestimated their choice. Patton we could have provoked into mistakes. Eisenhower gives us nothing to exploit. He advances slowly, but he never retreats, never exposes a flank, never runs out of supplies. Behind him, their factories produce more in a week than we produce in a month. Every day the weight grows heavier. This is not a war we can win through cleverness anymore. They have made it a war of production, and in production, they have already won. If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.